In my previous video titled as Images in Prayer, Saint Teresa speaks about two different types of images in prayer. One is the image of water and the second is the image of 7 mansions. Speaking about the images of water, Saint Teresa compares a soul to a garden, and she says there are 4 different ways that this soul can be watered. That is, there are 4 different ways a soul can reach the ultimate union with God through prayer. And so the first one, she says, by lowering a bucket in a well and drawing up the water. That involves huge amount of effort. The second, she says, is by cranking up a wheel and guiding a water through an aqueduct to a garden. Does not involve much effort though. Number 3, she says, is by an affluence or an overflow of a water from a river or a stream. This involves no effort at all. But according to Saint Teresa, the best way is by a gentle but an abundance of rainfall, by which the Lord Himself waters the garden and the soul makes no effort at all. And that is the best way of prayer for a soul, according to Saint Teresa. Today we are going to begin our study on another part of her images. That was second part of images was 7 mansions. In this video today we are going to study about the first 3 mansions. Or these 7 mansions can be called as 7 different stages of prayer or growth in prayer. We're taking first 3 together, or the first 3 mansions together for our study today. It's because they are almost identical and there is a single running thread of thought that we can identify in our studies. The first mansions. Saint Teresa's starting point is the absolutely basic condition for a serious prayer life, an earnest, continuing effort to rid oneself of sins, imperfections, and attachments. One may assume that to engage successfully in a meditative prayer, one needs most of all to find the right methods, techniques, and processes. Not so Teresa. She knows better. Communion with Christ cannot be produced by techniques because it is above all a love matter before it is anything else, and precisely because interpersonal intimacy is its heart, it is suffocated and even killed by selfishness in any form. Hence, in writing of the first 3 mansions, Saint Teresa wisely spends much time explaining how the beginner in prayer, even though in the state of grace, can and must emerge from the whole web of more or less petty faults. First of all, we may allow Saint Teresa to describe just what kind of people she has in mind. On the plus side, she is speaking of men and women who want to avoid offending God and who may perform good works, yet they are at this early stage still absorbed in worldly matters and pleasures, and they are puffed up with worldly honors and ambitions. Because they are free from serious sin, the king does dwell in their castle, but they have only tenuous relationship with him, and they scarcely see his light, so submerged are they in things of the world. Neither Jesus nor Teresa explains spiritual retardation as resulting from a lack of techniques or methods. In almost identical terms, they lay the blame on the free will choice of worldliness in its sundry forms. What then is the beginner to do? Most people cannot leave the world in a bodily sense. But every follower of Christ who is serious about genuine growth must leave the spirit of the world behind. Everyone, says Teresa, who wishes to go on to the second mansions will be well advised, as far as his state of life permits, to try to put aside all the unnecessary affairs and business. For those who hope to reach the principal mansion, this is so important that unless they begin in this way, Saint Teresa does not believe they will ever be able to get there. The New Testament has already admonished us that we must not love this passing world or anything that is in it. For the love of the Father cannot exist in the person who loves the world, the sensual body, the lustful eye, pride in possessions. God's grace has taught us that what we have to do is to give up everything that does not lead to God, that includes all our worldly ambitions. The main business of the beginner, therefore, is to make a determined turnabout from preoccupations with this worldly world to a life centered in the Trinity. The struggle will be long and at times hard, but there is no other way to accomplish the ascent of the mountain and reach the rewarding outcome that awaits one at the summit. The advice Saint Teresa offers to the beginners in prayer is extremely simple. There are no complicated steps or sub-steps. What she insists upon is utterly basic and indispensable. In whatever degree of prayer one is in, it is love, not reasoning, that is primary. She makes this very point in one of her most frequently cited statements. If you would progress a long way on this road and ascend to the mansions of your desire, the important thing is not to think much, but to love much. She offers the same advice to a layman whom she writes. You must not tire yourself by trying to think a great deal, nor worry about meditation. Keep occupying yourself all the time with the praise of the Lord. The second mentions. We may clarify what Saint Teresa has to say about the second mentions by grouping her thoughts under two categories of traits and advice. First, the traits. What are these people like who have made some progress but are as yet still far from their destination? They are still engaged in worldly pastimes, half giving them up, half clinging to them. They see imperfectly and they act imperfectly, but nonetheless, some growth in their spiritual life, in their prayer has occurred. God is calling them ceaselessly, and they are able to hear God call them now. In the first mentions, they were both deaf and dumb, but now the message is beginning to get through. Yet these people are not able to do the divine bidding immediately, for they are weak and irresolute. God's appeal to them come in several ways, like conversation with good people, sermons and homilies, good reading, sickness and other trials, divine light during prayer. The man or woman in the second mansion is a battleground where the conflict between the world and the divine call is being waged. There is a tug of war going on, and the individual experiences two opposing poles. World's tug is experienced in several ways. Earthly pleasures remain attractive, and they appear as though almost eternal. Soul finds it hard to give up esteem in the world and a selfish clinging to family and friends. It unreasonably fears doing penances to which it now feels called, and it vacillates, says Teresa, as to whether to return to the first mansions or to strive bravely on to the next mansions. In the opposite direction, God's tug is likewise felt in diverse manners. Reason itself shows the person how mistaken the world's message is and why it is mistaken. Significant growth has now taken place and has instilled a conviction that only in God is one's surety. Thus, the will is inclined to love Him and to press on to leave the worldliness and all its falsehoods. Given this conflict between the human and the divine, it is not surprising that the person in the second mansions is still a child in the practice of humility, obedience, love, and patience. In her charming manner, the saint observes that the virtues are young, that they have not learned to walk. In fact, they have just been born. Hence, if prayer is to grow in depth, gospel living must be perfected. The first cannot happen without the second. What then is the program for those in the second mansions? St. Teresa's first bit of advice concerns companionship. The soul should avoid close association with evil and mediocre people, and make it a point to mix with good people. That is, not only with those in the early mansions, but also with those who have advanced into mansions nearer the center, where the king is. To be in close touch with these latter is great help, for they tend to bring others to higher things along with themselves. Second, there is need to embrace the cross along with the suffering Lord. Resignation is not enough. There must be a generous willed welcome to hardships and dryness in prayer. Third, there is a typical Teresian insistence on daily fidelity to the divine will. All that the beginner in prayer has to do is to labor and be resolute and prepare himself with all possible diligence to bring his will into conformity with the will of God. The more one does this, the more he will receive the Lord. In the divine will, our entire welfare is to be found. In saying this, St. Teresa is reflecting on the teaching of Jesus himself. It is not those who merely proclaim, Lord, Lord, who enter the kingdom, but those who do the Father's will. Fourth, when one falls, there is no reason to lose heart, but rather to continue making serious efforts towards progressing. People in the second mansions surely do fall, and if they repent and persevere in their efforts, God will bring good even out of the failures. St. Paul himself, noting that he was not yet perfect, forgot what was behind and pressed on. Indeed, he raced toward the finish. Finally, St. Teresa adds, people in the second mansions need to exercise fidelity to prayer. We cannot enter heaven without first entering into our souls, getting to know ourselves better, reflecting on the divine goodness and our need for mercy. The door by which we can enter this castle is prayer. There is no other, for Jesus is himself the door. And the third mansions, The soul in the third mansions are of tender conscience. They are careful not to offend God. They avoid committing even venial sins. They love doing penance. They spend hours in recollection. They use their time well. They practice works of charity towards their neighbors, and they are very careful in their speech and dress in the government of their household. Once again, Saint Teresa says little about prayer life as such, but a great deal about doing the will of the Father. She remarks that in the first three mansions, human nature is an oppressive burden on the spirit, like a great load of earth on our back. She adds that it shall be otherwise in the following mansions. Anyone who has labored faithfully in the first stages of prayer knows how true that is, for it is only later, with the reception of infused prayer, that inner freedom becomes pronounced. Then one does more easily and joyfully what ought to be done and omits what ought to be omitted. However, while one is at this stage, sometimes receives a few glimpses of the delights later to be had in prayer. For the most part, he finds few spiritual joys. How long one can expect to remain in the mansions 1 through 3 before beginning to enter those of the infused contemplation? Saint Teresa does not speak strongly on this point, but she clearly inclines to the view that ordinarily people remain for a long time in the first three mansions. How does one pray in the third mansions? Again, she says very little about this question of prayer, even at this stage, because prayer at this stage is only human, still somewhat discursive. She does say that an active focusing on the indwelling presence of the Trinity is the best way to prepare for the prayer of quiet, and this advice applies to first two mansions as well. Well, having looked at these three mansions, we can compare the first three mansions to the first image of water, that to water the garden, in the first image of water, we said that to water the garden, you need to lower the bucket and get the water out of the well. That involves efforts. And so in the first three mansions of Saint Teresa involves an effort, as we heard, a human effort to get rid of our imperfections, our impurities, of our sins, and most of all, trying to conform our wills to the will of God. That calls upon us to put in a lot of effort in our prayer and our spiritual life in order to grow up to the different stages of prayer. Interestingly, in the next video, in the fourth stage or the fourth mansions, you will see the picture is totally different. Well, the next video will be on the fourth mansions. Thank you for watching this video.